For joining us today. My name is Kelsey Nelson. I'm on the product marketing team at Okta, and I'm excited to be here to chat a bit about this next phase of distributed work, which is really focusing on automation. We'll just jump right in without further ado. The last few months have been pretty crazy times, a lot of uncertainty as organizations needed to rapidly move and enable what was often not previously enabled distributed work or remote work capabilities. And with that came a variety of challenges, certainly from a technology perspective, but also from a cultural, from a working perspective. And I think one of the silver linings from this pandemic is that we're seeing that these types of different work styles have been actually positive for many users. And I thought this World Economic Forum quote was pretty telling, including finding that more than half of employees felt they could collaborate more easily and be even more productive at home. And so as we start to look ahead to this next phase, even knowing that uncertainty is probably going to prevail in many parts of the world for some time ahead, how can we start to take some of the goodness of what we've seen from the past few months and really enable it for the long term? We wouldn't be able to do that without taking a look at what we've done already to date. And so things like being able to shift into that immediate telework that involved things like adopting new collaboration tools, things like video conferencing, which I think we're all very intimately familiar with at this point. Also being able to access a variety of tools, be they cloud, be they on-prem, from a variety of devices, be it personal and professional, and doing so all with being able to balance both that end user ability and also security. Because as much as I wish our threat actors had given us a break during the first few months, the reality is that they didn't. And I think we saw even upwards of 600% growth in things like credential and phishing attacks in those first few months. And so a lot of work was done over that initial period to really support businesses through this time. And what we saw is that those companies that are really leading were those that were able to balance that ability to deliver productivity and deliver that new ways of working while thinking through that shifted security perimeter. And so now as we start to look ahead to what is this next phase, we really see organizations moving more into setting up for long-term success. So starting again in that stage 0, maybe they had some sort of on-prem, things like an Active Directory, maybe they were starting to adopt cloud, but maybe had limited or no remote work capabilities. In stage 1, we saw organizations, again, really taking on a lot of those projects like adding MFA to a VPN, to new cloud applications, expanding that VPN capacity, and ideally simplifying the user experience where possible. But now that we're some time in, what can we use from this new time and start to put forward so that regardless of if our workers are in the office or if they're working from a different location, that they're still going to have that great experience, that we can continue to deliver on our missions for our businesses and support innovation in the future. And so what we're seeing today is really a focus on how can we start to automate where possible. Things like on and offboarding are a really great place where we can lighten the load on IT so that they can start to focus on some of these other projects that help drive the business forward. We'll also touch on just a couple of other examples of things like setting context-based access policies, continuing to be flexible for the uncertainty ahead, and all of this really setting up that foundation for a strong zero trust security future. So again, what we'll focus on for this session, because we do only have a short time for today, is really to focus on a big piece of this next phase, which is focusing on that end user. So we'll start by spending the bulk of the time talking through that getting the right people, the right access from day one. So the automating on and offboarding of the different users. We'll then talk about once that user has been assigned the right applications, how can we use different contextual risk signals to assure that it's them before we give them access to those tools. And then lastly, we'll talk through sort of the end user benefits of doing all of this. Now, before we jump in, I do want to just take a moment and say, why are we here? Who is Okta? So if you're unfamiliar, Okta is in the business of identity management, which means that it's our mission to ensure that any user can use any technology. And that comes in a few different flavors. When we talk about identity, we talk about it as either for identity for your workforce, so those employees, contractors, and partners. That's what you see on that computer screen on the right there, which is probably what Okta's best known for today, where a user would sign in, they would get access to all of the tools that they need to do their job. But we also do have a solution that takes that same strong authentication, authorization, and user store and puts it in the hands of developers so that as they're creating new experiences for customers, for partners, that they can build that into those externally facing resources. And of course, we do all of this with that strong identity-centric approach to zero trust security as the underlying foundation for both of these experiences. Now, I mentioned we're going to talk through 3 areas, so 3 tips as you're thinking through this distributed workforce of the future. And the first is really making sure that the right people have that right access from day one. So again, the automation piece. Now, why is this such a challenge? Why do we need to automate it? And what we see is that automating on and offboarding employees today can be very slow. And why? When we start to look at what some of the steps that are taken in order to get an employee set up for day one. And that starts with something like an employee may join, an HR person will add them into the HR system. Somehow that is communicated to the technology department, maybe via ticket, they shoot over an email. And then that IT person, the technologist, then assigns them all of the resources that they need to do their jobs. Now, this tends to and historically has been a very manual process. It can be disconnected. It's not necessarily fully synchronized. And what that means is that because it's such a manual process, it can be very error prone and it does require a lot of touches. Now, you can imagine that if you're only onboarding a few employees a week, that's still a lot of hours that you're spending on making sure that those users have everything that they need to do their jobs. But as your organization continues to grow and you have different users requiring different applications and many users joining or moving roles, that problem scales and gets more complex very, very quickly. And so this, you can imagine that this gets very complex and can be very burdensome for both IT and the end user, who are both spending a lot of time ensuring that they have the applications and the resources they need from day one to do their job. And so what we want to do is to move to a world where we have this automation starting from wherever that source of truth is. Oftentimes we do see that it's something like an HR system, but it could be whatever source of truth is your source of truth. And we feed that into a centralized repository that then assigns out all of that access, regardless of who the user is, if they have the right resources. And we want to make sure that that happens across all of these different user types, right? So not only employees, but also contractors, for example, and that when their roles change, that we're able to manage those different life cycle states. So if an employee is to join, that they're then provisioned and they join the right groups. So if they're joining and they're in Europe and their title contains sales, that we want to make sure that they join the sales department and that they get assigned those correct applications. Or if they're off board or if they're leaving the organization, then we're able to revoke that access as quickly as possible, and certainly protecting from a security perspective as well. And lastly, we want to make sure that as the user's roles change, or if we do need to make sure that they're added an additional resource, that we're able to accommodate those request and approval flows. So when we start to take a look at more tangibly what that looks like, we can say, again, take that example of a user who's joining the sales team. Maybe they're joining in Western Australia. So we have them, we want them to be assigned this application within Salesforce. So they join, they're automatically provisioned and set up an account in Salesforce. But ideally, we can even go a step further and we can also look up that user again, they're in Western Australia, look that up based on their user profile, and even go so far as to assign that territory within that application. So we're now able to go even a step further so that we're ensuring that user has a great experience from day one and that they're set up with the right resources. Ideally, we also too, if that user does change roles or that they leave, we want to take that same deep capability and be able to non-destructively deprovision. So as an example, something like a box, if a user is to leave, we want to be able to suspend that user so they no longer have access, but also be able to look up that user's manager and maybe transfer those files to the manager so that we're not actually deleting that content that may be important content for us to have in the future. We're just ensuring that user who has left no longer has access. Ideally too, we can also start to extrapolate this and take more granular actions throughout this process. So for example, creating new tickets and downstream systems, or being able to notify users and administrators of some of these different lifecycle changes. So wouldn't it be great if when that user joins in Western Australia, if not only they were assigned the right territory, but they got a nice email and they got a nice notification in Slack that said, hey, welcome aboard. Here's your new, here's where you're going to be assigned and here's your quota. So being able to do so, certainly we'd like to make this as easy as possible. So looking for ways to automate and in low or no code capacity. So something like this, being able to drag and drop in sort of an if this, then that flow makes it really easy to orchestrate across all of these different systems. So that was step one. We want to make sure that the user has been assigned the right access to the right resources. Now, once they've been assigned, we want to make sure that when they go ahead and authenticate that the risk is low, that we're sure that it's them that's actually getting access to that tool. And so that's really where contextual access, that adaptive risk, comes into play for adaptive access controls. Now, yes, this does tie into my favorite term, which is zero trust. And modern security doesn't have to mean zero trust. I know there's, feelings when we talk about zero trust. We don't trust no one ever. But what we do want to do is to start to rethink some of those traditional security controls. So moving away from that castle and moat approach, and really someone I talked to once called it threat actor whack-a-mole, which is not an ideal scenario. And what we want to do is to move to a world where we can start to lay the foundation for a robust security strategy that brings in different contextual signals so that you understand risk. And we often find, and this is a great quote from Forrester Research that says that starting with identity and device is really a great foundation, again, that you're setting up for that longer term distributed work that'll help your businesses move forward. And so when we start to think about delivering that security and productivity, it really comes down to ensuring that right people have the right level of access, again, to the right resources. So we talked through making sure that we've assigned the right users to the right resource. And now we're going to talk on that context piece. So when we start to think through what that means more tangibly and bringing those signals together, is it really starts with the identity of the user and the device. And then we start to bring in those context signals from across different facets. So what do I know about that user? Are they, again, were they coming in from a Western Australian sales team? And what does that tell me? Are they an individual contributor? Or are they a manager? They're within sales. What do I know about their location? Are they always signing in from Western Australia? Are they signing in maybe from Sydney because they're traveling for work? What do I know about that user's typical patterns that may detect that something's anomalous? And not only do I want to be able to pull that directly from within the contextual signals that we see within the identity platform, but also feeding in third-party signals. So for example, in a distributed work environment, maybe I want to lean less heavily on the corporate network, and I want to look at something like the device. Is it a managed device? Is this the corporate-owned device that they're signing in from, or are they signing in from something different? Is the user, this is always a great example, something like Proofpoint. So I can use Proofpoint to see, because they support with email, they can see who the most targeted and the most attacked users are within your business. We can actually ingest that list into Okta, and then you can set policies. So again, I can start to say, hey, if we detect that something is amiss across any of this, these signals, then we can say, now I want to go ahead and prompt for a second factor or deny access. Or if I see that everything is typical, that what we see, it's a typical behavior pattern, then I want to go ahead and deliver a passwordless access, which actually makes life a lot easier for your end users, right? For only prompting for a second factor if something is detected to be anomalous, or we can go ahead and make things easier for end users if risk is low. And so this is a great way to leverage these contextual signals to ensure that now that the user has all the right resources, that it's as seamless as possible to get access and to get up and running every day. And of course, we want to make sure that we're feeding this all into our SIMs and our SOARs so that if something is detected to be anomalous, we can go ahead and take action on it as quickly as possible. So just a plug, if you're starting to look at some more specifics on how these all fit together, I mentioned Proofpoint, I mentioned some of the device posture. We also do work with a variety of folks like Netskope with their 𝐀𝐮𝐭𝐫𝐦𝐻, so that you can start to plug all these things together for a robust solution. So I would encourage you, if you're interested in talking more about how these different players fit together, this is just one great example. But lastly, what we want to do is we want to make sure that it's, again, I mentioned that passwordless access, making it easier on our end users cannot be understated. So making sure that users have access from day one, that we can deliver seamless access controls by better understanding risk, but also making sure that we have everything in a unified plane. And the reason why, and I think anyone who's joining from a security standpoint probably resonates, and yes, we can all gaze at this tiny GIF for a moment, but security hasn't historically always been in the driver's seat, right? Our end users have a tendency to try to circumvent controls if they're perceived to be cumbersome or burdensome. And so what we want to do is to move to a position where security is actually the end user's BFF, because they're doing things like making it easier to access applications by putting it all into a centralized place, and then delivering things like passwordless experience or only prompting for a second factor when risk is high. And in doing so, not only are things going to be better for your end users, but you're also going to see that end users actually want to put more things into that unified place because you're making it easier for them to get access. And so this is just a chart that shows that as time goes on, we tend to see organizations adopting more and more applications as businesses are using an identity platform. And that indicates that users want to put more in there. It's easier for them if they have just that one place to go. So again, as you're starting to think through this and you're really thinking about that longer term distributed work, be again the user in the corporate office, if the user's on the road, if the user's working from home, we really want to make sure that the experience is dashboard and mobile friendly, that they can access everything they need from one unified place. And that shouldn't just be cloud applications, that should be on-prem applications as well. It should be infrastructure, it should be APIs. We want to make sure that everything is in one unified place, so it's really easy for your employees to get running, and that you have a better visibility into everything that's going on across your ecosystem. So again, as we start to take a look and really optimize for where we're headed in the future, what we want to do is to put those foundational building blocks in place with that stage 2, with an eye towards stage 3. So automating on and offboarding. I've struggled with that one today. Automating on and offboarding where possible, because it's going to ensure that your end users are up and running from day one, but also that it's relieving the burden of a really manual task for your IT teams. Not to mention, it also enhances security by ensuring those users have only access to the things that they need, and that we can shut off that access if the user's role changes or if they leave the organization. We also definitely want to be able to, again, once they've been assigned the correct resources, that we're able to layer on those contextual, those adaptive access policies, so that users, we have a better sense of risk before we allow a user access into a resource, and we're only prompting for a second factor when risk is detected to be high. And lastly, that's going to really enable us to deliver a much better experience for our users, so that wherever we are, the uncertainty abounds, that they'll be able to have the best experience possible, so that they can focus on doing what's best for your business, and so can your IT and your security teams. So certainly a lot more here to come, but at least hopefully these few tips get you started on ways to be tackling and ways to be thinking about this next phase of distributed work, and the roles you can use, the role you can play in helping to use things like automation to set you up for success for this next phase. So your challenge is to go ahead and get started now. We are always happy to help. So if you do have questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. Here's my contact information, and thank you again so much for the time today.